Hello and welcome to the Chapter 6 lecture video on the integumentary system. We covered integumentary system in lab last week, so hopefully this gave you a little bit of foundation, or that gives you a little foundation for this lecture, and you remember some of those concepts that we're going to see again here. So just to start off with, reminding ourselves, last week we looked at tissues, and we talked about how tissues are cells that come together that have a similar function. So your muscle tissue, your epithelial tissue, they have this same kind of common function. And when multiple types of tissue come together, they form an organ. And so we'll see that your skin is an organ, your integumentary system, which includes the skin, is an organ. It has muscle tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, epithelial tissue, all four types, in various organizations, creating both the skin as the largest organ and the accessory structures of hair, nails, glands, and receptors, those nervous receptors. So your skin is the largest organ in the body by weight. It has those accessory structures, and together they make up the integumentary system. Generally, the skin acts as a barrier between the internal and external environment, and we'll get into the specific functions later. So your skin has two major layers, the epidermis and the dermis, and you'll also hear talk about the subcutaneous or hypodermis layer. We separate this out from the skin. It's a layer that's underneath the primary skin organ, and so we do include it because it's kind of this in-between space, and there's really not another good spot to put it when we're lecturing about the body. But primarily the skin is going to consist of the epidermis, which epi upon on the outside. It's that outer layer of stratified squamous epithelium. Hopefully after the tissue lecture you understand what that means, what the stratified meaning layered, squamous referring to the shape of the cells, and epithelium is that epithelial tissue covering the body. Beneath the epidermis is the dermis. This is a thicker layer. It has a lot of connective tissue, blood vessels, smooth muscle, and nervous tissue. It's where a lot of the accessory structures are housed. Your basement membrane separates the dermis from the epidermis and helps to hold the two of them together. And so this is just a layer of cells that helps to kind of keep things organized and structured. Like I said, beneath that hypodermis, below hypo, it's underneath the dermis. It has mostly areolar and adipose connective tissues. So the adipose tissue is really good for insulating and conserving body heat. That areolar loose connective tissue, again, helps to bind the skin to the muscles and structures underneath, but still has a little bit of this mobility to it. So it's not like it's so tightly anchored that the skin can't move and stretch a little bit. The subcutaneous layer also has larger blood vessels supplying to the skin. When you're in your dermis, you get a lot of smaller blood vessels and capillary beds, and so any cuts lower that go down into the hypodermis tend to bleed pretty strongly. Here's a cross-section of the integumentary system. Hopefully you remember this from lab, and you're pretty familiar with these structures and that organization, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Looking more into the epidermis. So as we said, the epidermis has that stratified squamous epithelium describing the shape and layers of the cells. It does not have any blood vessels. Your epidermis is avascular. Most of the blood supply that it gets is from the dermis. The cells, as they move away from the dermis, they start to die. They start to shift their structures and die. Typically, the epidermis has 4 layers in most spots and 5 layers in your thick skin of the hands and the palms. The deepest layer is the stratum basilae. Remember, stratum, strata, that means layer, and basilae, this basal root right here, that usually means like the lowest or the deepest. And so the stratum basilae, you also have the stratum germinativum, I guess. We're going to go with basilae. That's easier to say. That's your deepest layer of your epidermis. It's in every part, so we said we're going to kind of go through these 4 layers first. We'll talk specifically about that extra 5th layer in the thick skin, but assume that we're talking just about common things for all types of skin. So the stratum basilae has the dividing cells. This is the one that's closest to the blood vessels, so it is closest to that nourishment, and these cells are still alive. As the basal cells divide, they push older cells up, those keratinocytes, and remember that keratin protein that starts to fill up the cells as they move away from the blood vessels. They migrate towards the skin surface, and they're getting filled with that protein keratin. That eventually causes them to die. They harden, dehydrate, and that's the full keratinization process. And so your outer layer of your epidermis is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. We can add that modifier into it. So the epidermis, it protects against water loss, mechanical injury, chemicals, and microorganisms. Water loss by preventing dehydration, providing this kind of water-resistant barrier all over our body. Mechanical injury, so again, if you just kind of have a light scratch on the top of your skin, it probably won't bleed. Those cells slough off, and after an hour or so, you probably can't even see the scratch anymore, because that's how rapidly these cells start to divide. Chemicals, by providing a chemical barrier. If you are working with, let's say you're just cleaning your bathroom. You're just using regular household chemicals, Clorox or something, and you're cleaning your bathroom. After you use that, maybe you didn't use gloves because it was just, a Clorox wipe. Let's just say you're using one of those Clorox wipes to kind of clean things down, clean down the surface. It's fairly mild, right? It's not the highest concentration of chemicals in those wipes, but you can still smell it. You can feel it. It has a chemical component to it. And so hopefully you just know, oh, I need to wash my hands after I do that. I may not need to use gloves while I'm using a Clorox wipe, but after I've used that wipe, after I've thrown it away, then I want to wash my hands just in case there's any residual chemicals on there. But it's not like, because you have your skin, because you have your epidermis, you can be exposed to chemicals for a short period of time. Mild chemicals, right? Don't go and put me to the test and say, oh, he said I could expose myself to sulfuric acid. No, you have a limit. But for normal household chemicals, if they get onto your skin and you wash them off really quickly, there is no lasting damage. And so they do protect us from chemical burns and chemical injuries, as well as microorganisms, because those outer layers of the cells are dead. Things like viruses, bacteria can't infect them and can't replicate within them. The epidermis, I don't know if we really get into this here. I don't think we do in this lecture. But you also have your your body's natural flora, what we call that, your natural flora. It's your bacteria that are native to your body, and they are good bacteria. They don't make you sick. They are just part of normal life, and a lot of times our natural body flora helps and is necessary for our body's function. And on your skin, even no matter how good you are about washing your hands and doing all that, you have this natural layer of bacteria in your skin, and that actually helps to make sure no bad bacteria can replicate. Because if you have a good, healthy bacterium, then they're taking up all of the resources that any bad bacteria, harmful bacteria, might use to try and make you sick. And so our epidermis does that as well. Or it's the host of that side, those good bacteria. Okay, so looking at, we talked about the two types of skin, thick and thin. That difference is from the epidermis. So in thin skin, you have the basilae, spinosum, granulosum, and corneum. And then in thick skin, you add in that stratum lucidum between these two superficial layers, the granulosum and corneum. And so really for me, I won't say that. For lab, you're really only going to need to label the basilae and the corneum, but for lecture, it will get a little bit more specific. You might see questions about the spinosum, granulosum, and lucidum. So at least be familiar to this degree in what your textbook goes into with these different layers. The biggest thing is that you start at the stratum basilae that's closest to the blood vessels, and as they migrate further, as these cells divide, they kind of push other cells, the older cells, up and out. And once those cells start to get out of the blood supply, or removed from blood supply, they start to shift. They start to change their structure, which hopefully kind of makes sense. As you are removed from food and water, you would start to shift, and you would start to change how you hold yourself, and your skin would become more wrinkly, and you would start to shrivel up a little bit. And so that's exactly what's happening. These cells start to change their shape and change their internal characteristics, and you can kind of see it on microscopic images, this distinct shift in structure from the basilae cells to the spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and then the corneum, that final outer layer, no matter what the type of skin. The corneum are the outermost, dead, flattened, keratinized, and continuously shed from the outer skin surface. The stratum corneum on its own is 25 layers thick. And so these are the regions, right? These bold ones are the regions of the skin, but within these regions you can have multiple layers, multiple strata within them. There's, again, just that image. This should be pretty familiar to you from lab and looking at that. You have the dermis down here, this basement membrane that's kind of dividing the two of them. This is one of your dermal papilla, right? This kind of projection here is the dermal papilla. And then you start into those basilae cells, and you can see how they start to shift their color, shift their shape, everything in from the spinosum to the granulosum, that layer of lucidum, so this will tell you that's thick skin, and then finally this really flattened stratum corneum. Okay, so within the epidermis, there are a couple of different cell types. We talked about keratinocytes. There are also melanocytes. Melanocytes are special cells that make that pigment melanin, and they're found in the deepest layer. Melanin mostly protects the DNA of the nucleus from damage from UV radiation. So more melanin, typically more protection from sunlight, from UV radiation, but it's not a 100% guarantee. It's not completely foolproof. So taking some basic care and caution is always important, no matter how much melanin is expressed. And I say melanin expressed because melanin is we all have the same number of melanocytes in our body. It just depends on genetics and diet, things like that, how much actually gets expressed. So as I said, melanin shades the nucleus of the cell from UV radiation to prevent any mutation in your DNA, which is why we kind of link sunscreen with skin cancer and preventing skin cancer, because as that DNA gets mutated, they start to have irregular cellular divisions, and you can start to create sunspots and tumors and things like that. Melanin is that pigment for skin and hair color. More melanin that is expressed, the darker the skin or the hair will be. It's transferred from extensions of the melanocytes. It's a secretion process. It's called cytokine secretion, like endocrine, right? Cytokine secretion. So this is coming directly from the cell. And there are two types of melanin, eumelanin and pheomelanin. And we'll see that this is both for coloring the skin and for your hair as well. So eumelanin is that brownish black color. Pheomelanin is the reddish yellow for the lips. And again, just depending on how much is expressed personally, that will determine, well, maybe you have very, very light colored hair, very blondish colored hair, and so your eumelanin is not very well expressed. Maybe you have pink rosy lips, and so you have that degree of pheomelanin being expressed. Here are what these cells look like. You've got this melanocyte nucleus kind of here present. You can kind of see it stuck in here, and it's secreting. There's these extensions that are creeping along in between the epithelial cells, and they have their melanosomes, which are the little pockets of, or not pockets, but little bits of melanin, of that pigment. Yeah, little pigments, molecules of melanin. And real quick, you can see some cells going through cellular division. What phase in cellular division are these cells in? It's a nice little reminder for yourself. Can you identify the structures that are present within this cellular division and within this entire image that you're seeing? Okay, so skin color, looking at how skin color is produced a little more in detail. So all people, like as we said, have about the same number of melanocytes, but it is genetically determined what the actual color will be, and how much of those melanocytes are expressing their color. Involves the same amount of melanin that the melanocytes produce and the size, the distribution of the melanin granules. Skin color is from a combination of genetic, environmental, and physiological factors. Things like exposure to sunlight, UV light from SEM lamps, X-ray use causes the darkening of the skin because you start to increase your melanin production. So if you go out tanning, if you go out into the sunbed or into the sun, then your body is naturally going to start to express more of that melanin. But at a certain point, your genetic determination of how much is really going to be produced, you might reach a maximum. So that's why some people are able to get big swings in how light versus how tan and darker their skins can start to appear, because they have that genetic range. Whereas some people, it just seems no matter how much sun exposure you get, you just really never get much darker than a certain limit. And again, that's just that combination of genetic and environmental factors. But for those, that when if you are going to the tanning bed, or if you go out to the sun because you like to have the darker skin tone, that's totally great. But just recognize what your body is doing is that it's trying to protect itself. It's recognizing this harmful stimulus is coming towards it, so it's trying to produce more melanin to protect itself. So that's why there is so strong studies that show the direct link between UV exposure and skin cancer. And I say all this as someone who was able to start tanning when I was 13 years old, because I'm old enough that, now that you have to be 18, but it used to be there was no age limit. And so my mom had me in the tanning bed young because, she went and I was waiting for her, so why not? And so something to definitely think about. Skin color is also affected by circulation within your dermal blood vessels. Blood flow to certain areas is going to impact your skin color. Oxygen-rich blood has a bright red color. It's got that oxygen that really helps to lighten it up. And so that's going to be giving you more like a pinkish kind of hue to your skin. Whereas if you have really oxygen poor blood, let's say you have either bad circulation or you have poor respiration, then that can start to lead to a more bluish kind of appearance, which we call cyanosis. And usually that's a sign of some kind of pathology that's happening. If someone consistently has like a bluish tinge to their skin, it might mean that they're not quite getting enough oxygen. So it would definitely be a good thing to check their oxygen levels, maybe put them on some supplemental oxygen, maybe, if that's what's required, just to try to increase that oxygen carrying capacity. Skin color is also a factor from diet and disease, those environmental factors. Something like yellowish skin can come from eating too many oranges or carrots. Things with carotene in them can start to turn your skin a little yellowish color. If you've ever seen that episode of Gilligan's Island where they get all that radioactive fruit, that's immediately what my brain goes to. And something like a bright yellow color can actually be called jaundice. It can come from jaundice due to liver disease, your liver not functioning properly, and then that can cause your skin to turn that bright yellow color. And so either one would be, you know, if your skin starts changing color, go see a doctor, okay? Especially if it's like this bright yellow color. Jaundice can be absolutely fatal, and within a couple of days of starting to show symptoms, you can die from that. And so any shifts in your skin color, skin, because it's your largest organ, your nails, things like that, are a really good indicator of let me say really good indicator. They can be a good indicator of certain diseases and certain pathologies because they are so expressive based on those factors. So just being aware of things that change. When things start to change in the body, it's always good to kind of keep an eye on that and be aware of that. All right, deep to the epidermis, we have the layers of the dermis. I say layers, we have the dermis. The dermis is binding that epidermis to the underlying tissues, muscles, skin, muscles and bones, things like that. That border between the two is uneven because you have the dermal papillae. Those are extending upward from the dermis into the epidermis. And something I haven't really mentioned yet, the things that they interlock with are the epidermal ridges. So when you look at the dermal papillae, you can see that it's kind of like a little mountain ridge of the dermis, but it's interlocking with a valley of the epidermis. And so that's that epidermal ridges. I'm just kind of interdigitating together. The dermal papillae also form our fingerprints. They help that specific orientation layout of the dermal papillae that's unique to everybody provide for our fingerprint structure. The dermis is mostly areolar and dense connective tissue. That's kind of the underlying substance within the dermis. And then all throughout, you have those accessory structures. A lot of collagen fibers, elastic fibers. That's what helps to give skin its stretchiness, but then its resiliency. The fact that you can kind of pull and roll your skin and then it goes right back to its same shape. As we age, we lose these collagen fibers, and so our skin tends to wrinkle and hold that shape a little bit more. If you're dehydrated, the same thing can happen. Your skin doesn't quite retract like it should when you're fully hydrated. Again, those fibers providing toughness and elasticity to the skin. You also have dermal blood vessels in your dermis, carrying nutrients to those upper layers, that stratum basilae, and regulating your body temperature. We'll see how the body responds to increases and decreases of temperature by conserving or releasing heat through the dermis. There's also nerve fibers. We looked at tactile and Meissner corpuscles. We looked at free nerve endings, things like that. You have sensory receptors, hair follicles, sebaceous, and sweat glands. All those things held in the dermis. All right, looking at these accessory structures, notice this says epidermal derivatives. And if you think about how the epidermis produces its cells and grows, right, from the stratum basilae being vascular, and then as it goes further and further from the basilae, it starts to shift in its shape because it doesn't have access to blood vessels, and then it starts to change that function of those cells as well. Same thing with nails and hair. These epidermal derivatives mean, derivative being a term that's meaning like a change, like you start with the epidermis, that's the original, and then we can derivate a little bit. We can shift a little bit from the epidermis, but it still has the same similar features and functions. So nails, these are protective coverings over the ends of your fingers and toes. They have a nail plate that covers the skin. We also call that the nail body. And the layer of skin underneath is called the nail bed because you lay your body on your bed. So the nail bed is the layer of skin that your hardened nail plate, your nail body is actually covering. So you can touch the nail body and you can push down on it and see how blood is kind of pushed out of the nail bed, and then when you let up, it returns that kind of pinkish color. The lunula is the half moon shape at the base of the nail plate. It is part of your nail matrix, the active growing region of the nail. So as cells from the matrix divide, they push out. Those cells become keratinized, just like other parts of the skin. Keratin in the nails is harder than that of the corneum. It's just a slightly different variation of keratin, a higher concentration of it for sure too. And so that causes the nails to be harder than your stratum corneum. And thank goodness, because that would be very strange if the whole skin of our body was the same hardness as our nails. Nail appearance affected by genetics, injury, nutritional deficiencies, disease, and aging. And again, it can be used in medical diagnoses. Hair, skin, nails are very much indicative of nutrient status, and they are affected by that. If you have kind of flaky ridges in your nails, white spots in your nails, all those kind of things can be indicative of some underlying either nutritional or medical diagnosis. Here's, again, cross structure of it, or cross section over here in a superior view right over this one. Should be pretty straightforward from after our lab lecture, but definitely go through and be able to identify all these structures that are listed, and then maybe even some of the underlying structures that you're seeing. Okay, so looking at hair and hair follicles, so still in those epidermal derivatives. Hair is found in nearly all regions of the skin, excluding palms, soles of the feet, lips, nipples, and parts of the external genitals. Those hairs develop from epithelial stem cells. So the fact that they're stem cells mean that those cells are going to are very, very long lasting. And as they divide, you still have one of those stem cells. You know, one cell divides into two cells. Well, only one of those two cells will kind of continue to change and move and actually become a hair cell. The rest of them are going to stay as a stem cell producing new hair cells. That's why you continue to have hair growing, and you don't, until a certain age. But well, even after that, hair still can grow for a long, long time. Anyway, hair develops from those epithelial stem cells at the base of a depression called your hair follicle. So it starts at the hair follicle and it grows up from there. Those hair follicles go down into the dermis, sometimes the subcutaneous layers. They can be pretty deep rooted. The deepest part of the root is called the bulb. That's that enlarged portion of the hair. Again, I talk about the hair root. For me, the root is anything from below the skin surface to the hair bulb. So all of that region that's not visible, that's not exposed to the external environment, that is all the root. And then the very, very bottom enlarged portion is the hair bulb. This is what contains the matrix and is what is actually producing new cells. So within the hair matrix, you have dermal blood vessels. Right at that hair papilla, so there's that word papilla again. Remember, it's just referring to like a shape. It's not referring to actual specific isolated structures. It's just the shape of that. So the hair papilla presses up into the bulb, into the matrix, and that is what's supplying blood vessels, so those cells can continue to divide and push up, forming the hair shaft. And there it is. As the cells are formed in the bulb, they push outward, they get keratinized, they die, and they become the hair shaft, the actual kind of portion that you would think of as a hair and the part that you can touch. So then, therefore, hair is composed of dead, keratinized epithelial cells. So it sounds just like our skin, normal skin cells, but it's just modified slightly. So that's why we call it the derivatives. Here's that structure of the hair follicle, the entire hair follicle. So you can see the shaft portion below the skin is this root. Enlarged down here at the bottom is the bulb with the dermal papilla, the hair papilla rather, providing blood vessels. And there's an enlarged picture of the hair matrix and the papilla. Okay, hair color and properties. So hair color, like skin color, is determined by genetics. That determines the type of amount of melanin produced. You have the same thing, eumelanin and pheomelanin, like we had in our skin. So eumelanin, the brownish black, pheomelanin, the reddish yellow. And so you have different combinations of these all throughout your hairs that give it its kind of natural color. A lack of melanin or older age can cause albinism. So the hairs, your body is just not producing any of those melanin, and so you just have white hair. A mixture of pigmented and unpigmented is gray. And so kind of if you have, depending on how much each of those cells is producing its melanin or not producing its melanin, it's kind of like just like mixing up paints. You kind of get this mixture of the two colors. That's why there's some people with slightly different types of gray hair. You can have gray hair, but then it can be maybe a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, right in the middle. It just depends on those genetics that are being expressed. We also, in lab, we talked about the erector pili muscle. This is a muscle that attaches to the bottom of the hair follicle. And when you get cold, when you get scared, emotional upset, right, whatever it may be, that muscle contracts and it pulls the hair follicle, because most hair follicles are inserted into the dermis at an angle. It will pull the hair follicle so that it's actually vertical, completely vertical, upright, and the hair points up. Inside of your skin, you also have glands. We talked about sebaceous and sweat glands. So sebaceous glands are your oil glands that secrete sebum. These are the glands that are glommed right onto the hair follicle itself. So sebaceous glands do not have a duct that connects them to the hair follicle. They are directly attached to the hair follicle. And as they secrete their sebum, that helps to waterproof and soften your hair and skin. These are a type of holocrine glands, so they're actually bursting open to release their secretion once they're fully matured. And again, they're associated directly with hair follicles. Your sweat glands are also called sudoriferous glands. So you'll hear both of those terms. Sweat is obviously a little bit kind of more common for what we do and for what most of us understand. But if you hear sudoriferous, it's also just referring to your sweat glands. So these release their secretions through exocytosis. They kind of make their secretions, they package them up, send it to their plasma membrane, and then it's released that way. So these cells aren't bursting once they fully mature. Two types of sweat glands, the eccrine and the apocrine. I think when we did lab, we just referred to merocrine and apocrine, so don't let that confuse you. They're still, you can still talk about your merocrine glands and your apocrine glands. So eccrine / merocrine, we're going to kind of let eccrine be the main merocrine glands. Those are the most common ones. They respond to body temperature, they're active your entire life. More abundant, you find them kind of all over yourself. The apocrine, right, we said apocrine are for apocrine axial adulthood, I think was the other A we used. I can't remember what other A we used. But apocrine are the ones that become active during puberty. They are mostly found in your axillary and groin regions, and they release their secretions, yes, based on temperature, but also emotional arousal, pain, upset, that kind of stuff. And they contribute the body odor. They help contribute to body odor that we associate with those areas. Oh, that was the other thing. These eccrine merocrine glands, they are going to secrete directly to the skin surface, so they have a duct that connects them from their gland body through to the sweat pore. Apocrine are going to have a duct that connects to the hair follicle and then releases through the follicle pore rather than through a sweat pore. But apocrine have a duct, whereas sebaceous glands are directly attached to the hair follicle. No duct. Modified sweat glands, so this might kind of, the body is an amazing thing, and it likes to just find a structure that works and then just change it around a little bit. So ceruminous and mammary glands are both modified sweat glands. Mammary glands secreting milk, obviously, and ceruminous glands are earwax to trap dust and pathogens. So our bodies found a structure, those sweat glands that work, and they said, well, we can just change this around a little bit, and it'll work great for producing milk and earwax. Okay, so now let's look at some of the specific functions of the skin now that we've talked about the structure and the accessory organs of the skin. So basic functions, important for maintaining homeostasis. So again, homeostasis is that balance of our body, that tendency for it to return to that standard neutral internal environment. So things like waste excretion, water regulation, temperature regulation, all of that is going to be, your skin plays a part in all of that. The skin acts as a protective covering, preventing substances from both going in and out, and protecting the underlying tissue. It acts as a waterproof barrier, so it helps to slow down water loss by diffusion. It still happens, right? We still lose a little bit of water, especially as you sweat. If you're outside, if you're exposed to heat, fire, things like that, water will naturally leach from your skin just through that diffusion process, but the skin definitely slows it down. One of the biggest dangers with burns, if you have even not even severe burns, but just kind of even level 1 burns, is dehydration. Especially though if you do have large damage to your skin, if you actually burning off regions of your skin, besides the infection aspect of it, and making sure that you're not exposed to infections. Another immediate cause of concern is your hydration status, because you lose a lot of water. One, just from the act of getting burned, it's going to draw out a lot of the body's moisture. But then by having your skin, if it's burned away, not having that waterproofing barrier, your body continues to lose water continuously, and so that dehydration can be a big factor in burn victims. Melanin pigment, we talked about that, protecting against UV radiation. There are sensory receptors for touch, pressure, pain, temperature, things like that. That just kind of give us that first warning of, oop, nope, that's not good for me. Nope, shouldn't touch that. And they, we hopefully tend to we learn to listen to those as we age. We get better about feeling those sensations of, ooh, that's going to be hot. I should not touch that, because our body will give us kind of warnings before we even touch those things. And so those are all housed within your skin. The skin excretes waste products. It releases urea, only 50%. You only sweat out so much. And please, if you remember anything from this lecture, please remember that going to the steam room, going to the sauna, going and doing a workout and sweating it out does not sweat out toxins. There is a difference between toxins and waste products. Toxins are filtered through your kidneys, through your liver, and are excreted out through your urinary or digestive tracts. Your skin does release waste. It does release that urea product, but your body always retains at least 50% of your urea. So at a certain point, it's not even releasing urea anymore. And so you aren't purifying or detoxing the more you sweat. It might feel good and relaxing to go and sit in a sauna or something like that, but it's not purifying in that sense. There's really not a medical benefit to saunas or steam rooms. Skin conducts some chemical reactions in the synthesis of vitamin D. That's important for bone and tooth development. One of the reasons, and this is always a kind of interesting thing to talk about, one of the reasons that we see the shift in skin colors from the equator as you go north or south is because the equatorial regions are very much exposed to more sunlight. And so if you think about in Africa, where life originated, where humans originated, you have, people tend to have very, very dark skin tones because they're being exposed to so much sunlight. So the extra melanin expression helps to shield their cells from UV radiation. And because they're getting so much sunlight, they're still absorbing a proper amount of vitamin D. And so they're not losing anything out on there. But as humans started to migrate north, they started to not be exposed to as much sun. And so their bodies were still producing a lot of melanin, they were still expressing a lot of melanin, but what's starting to happen is that they were getting really deficient in vitamin D. And so those people that had less melanin expression were able to have stronger bones, stronger teeth, and able to survive longer than people that had a lot of melanin expression, because those people were not getting the amount of vitamin D absorption necessary. And so as you see, that's why you see this change in skin color as humans start to move north and as you start to move away from the equatorial regions. It's because, well, when you're not being exposed to as much sun, you don't need the UV radiation protection, but you do need more vitamin D absorption. It's also why you start to see things like limb length starting to shift. Having longer limbs allows you to have more skin, which means you can get rid of heat a lot easier and regulate your body temperature better. Well, as you move north, you have cooler temperatures, you need shorter limbs to be able to conserve more heat. And so it's very interesting that you can see, kind of understanding why humans start to shift and look different as we move around the world. Well, it's because of these basic, evolutionary processes. Skin is important for body temperature regulation, like I was saying, not just, and we'll look specifically at how the blood vessels, vasodilation and constriction affect that, but also through sweat gland activation. And it synthesizes certain biochemicals within the skin as well. All right, so role of skin and body temperature regulation. So proper temperature regulation is important to maintaining optimal metabolic reaction rates. So having our body exists within a very narrow range of what is normal, and so our body is constantly working to kind of keep us in that space, and that's that optimal metabolic reaction rate occurs at that temperature. Skin plays this major role with the hypothalamus controlling the process. We'll learn more about our hypothalamus when we get into the endocrine lectures and the nervous system lectures. It's this gland in your brain that responds to a lot of stimuli, kind of is like the overall control center of your body's autonomic process. Active cells like your heart, your skeletal muscles, your kidneys, your liver, those all produce heat. The more active a cell is, heat is a waste product, so the more active a cell, the more metabolic a cell is, the more heat that it's going to produce. Your blood absorbs that heat and then transfers it all throughout your body. And so your body temperature is maintained by your blood connecting and transferring that heat waste product and kind of moving it all through your cells and tissues. So blood tends to be a couple of degrees warmer than actual body temperature because it's transferring that heat. Heat can then be lost to the surroundings from the skin through radiation, so just heat kind of moving off of your body. Sometimes, if someone's like they just finished working out, they just finished running or something, and you don't even have to touch them. You can just kind of have your hand, a couple of inches or so from their skin, and you can feel the heat coming off of them. That's that radiating heat. And the evaporation of sweat. As our body produces water and then water evaporates, that breaking of those bonds from liquid into vapor actually releases heat and energy and cools our body off. So sweat doesn't cool you down by removing your water. It cools you down by evaporating off of your body. That breaking of those bonds cools us down little by little. Okay, so looking at responses to heat, both hyperthermia and hypothermia. So hyperthermia, an excess heat, let's say that you were working out outside, you didn't hydrate enough, and all of a sudden your body is very much overheating. What's going to happen is that the blood vessels in your dermis are going to start to vasodilate, meaning they're going to open up even larger. That's going to allow more blood to go into your skin and then be released from the body. The sweat glands also get activated, so that way they can help with cooling down the body. But this is why when people tend to, after they've been running for a while, their faces get really red. I'm one of those people. It will probably happen at some point during the semester in lab where I'll, walking up the stairs sometimes is enough to do it. If it's hot outside and I'm rushing, my face will just get bright red because the blood vessels in my skin are opening up. They're sending more blood to the skin surface so that heat can radiate off. The opposite is true for hypothermia. So let's say you are being put out into the cold. Your blood vessels are naturally going to constrict, so that way blood doesn't get exposed to that cold external environment. If your body was to allow the blood to go towards the skin surface when you're in really cold temperatures, that would actually cool your blood down and then cool down your whole body, because the blood would then be transporting colder temperature rather than your nice warm blood temperature. And so that's why people tend to look really pale and might even start to get blue and black, fingertips and nose and frostbite when they're exposed to prolonged cold temperatures. It's not the cold that causes your skin to turn blue and then frostbite to set in and for your nose to turn black and your fingers to turn black and die. The cold causes the blood vessels to restrict, and it's the lack of blood flow to those areas that causes them to die. So the colder it is, the more your blood vessels are going to restrict, because you can live with a frostbitten nose. You can live with frostbitten fingers. You can live if you don't even have your fingers at all. You cannot live if your core temperature starts to drop too low. If your heart, your kidneys, your liver, your digestive organs, if they start to drop too low, you will die. Your brain, you will die. And so our body sacrifices those peripheral organs, those peripheral structures, nose, fingers, toes, things like that, genitals as well. It will sacrifice those to keep your body warm and your core temperature alive. And so that's that shift of hypothermia, is this constricting of the dermal blood vessels to make sure that the blood doesn't get too cold. It also inactivates sweat glands and activates the shivering response. This is a reflex, an involuntary reflex, where I think we've all shivered at one point in our life, and it's a skeletal muscle contraction. Your skeletal muscles are shaking to try and increase heat production. The more that they kind of do those micro contractions, they cause an increase in cellular respiration, and that produces more heat that your blood can then take and transfer through your body. So allow yourself to shiver if you are cold. It will help to warm you up. But maybe also put on a jacket, put on a coat, get into a warmer area. Okay, so now we can get into healing of wounds. When we go through A&P, there's a lot that can go into wound healing. So we're not going to look at how every organ works to heal wounds, but we are going to look at the skin because it does a pretty good job of giving you an overview of it. I say that we will look at the skin. We look at bone wound healing as well. We look at some nervous system wound healing, but we're not going to, go into how the kidneys repair themselves, how the liver repairs itself. Well, we won't get that detailed. But the skin has a very kind of universal response, and it's an interesting one to look at. So in the healing of wounds, one of the first steps is inflammation. Which might kind of seem counterintuitive when you have a wound. The reason that the blood is coming to that area, it's not just because you cut those blood vessels. There's also the inflammation process that happens, which is actually sending more blood to that spot. By sending more blood and by dilating those vessels, they become more permeable, allowing more things to flow out. But that is a normal response to the body's injury or stress. Those dilated blood vessels are bringing in new fluids, fresh fluids, oxygen, nutrients, and immune cells, white blood cells, all to help in healing. So part of that inflammatory process, while it can be upsetting because it causes you to bleed even more, it can be painful, it has its own side effects, it is bringing in all these fresh nutrients to help in the healing process. Superficial cuts, filled in by reproducing epithelial cells. If you just get a small little paper cut or something, it might bleed for a couple of minutes, maybe even just 1 minute or so. You add a little pressure, and then very quickly, even if you don't put a Band-Aid over it, sometimes it's like, oh, well, it's not even bleeding anymore. Put a Band-Aid over it, cover it just to make sure. But your body, these really rapidly reproducing epithelial cells, will just kind of fill it right in. They just kind of fill in that little cut, and you might forget about it. You probably won't even have a mark or a scar. In a couple of days, it's all fine. If you have a deeper injury that goes into the dermis or subcutaneous layer, that definitely has a more extensive response. You're getting into larger structures, you're cutting through connective tissue, and so there's a lot more things that have to be repaired. This table is helpful. The symptoms of inflammation: redness, heat, swelling, pain. I'll add another one in here: loss of function. That's another thing that comes in with inflammation. Thinking about like maybe your knee or something. If your knee gets really swollen, it can't bend and flex. It can't bend and straighten like it normally would. You can't put weight on it like it normally would. So you lose this functionality. But typically redness from that vasodilation, more blood is coming to the area. So if there's a spot on your body, you have a cut that turns really red all around it, well, that's that redness, that's that inflammation for more blood. Heat, again, blood is transferring heat throughout the body. And so when you have an increase in blood flow to an area, you're going to increase the heat as well. Swelling because of, well, here you go, more blood. You have more blood, more fluids going into that space, and so it's going to be swelling up. And then pain. Pain comes from the increased pressure from edema. So as the fluids move into that wounded area, they're going to start to press on neurons within that space, and that's going to trigger a pain response. So that's why something like ibuprofen, Tylenol, they help with swelling and they help with pain because they're causing blood to drain out of that area. They're reducing the vasodilation of those spots. And it kind of helps with all of these symptoms by just reducing the dilation of blood vessels. All of that to be said, you can hopefully now see why it's important to mitigate how much ibuprofen, how much pain medicine you're taking, because it can inhibit your body's actual healing response. That's why typically they say, as long as its temperature is not too much, as long as, the pain isn't too much, try to allow your body to go through its natural healing process because there is reasons for the redness and the heat, the pain and the swelling. So when you're healing a deep wound, let's say that goes into the dermis or subcutaneous, one of the first things that happens is the formation of a blood clot from all that released blood. Eventually, if you have a cut, it does stop bleeding, and that's because you start to form this blood clot. And then after a blood clot is formed, you have all those new tissues, new cells running in. They start to form a scab. The blood starts to kind of coagulate and it starts to form a scab to cover the wound. And this is just a temporary patch. Right, and you kind of know that if you know not to pick a scab off. If something scabs over, you just let it be, because eventually the cells underneath the scab are going to start to heal and repair. And once they're fully repaired, that scab falls off all on its own. But if you start to pick it off and you pick your scab too early, it starts bleeding again, and then the whole process has to start over. You might have an even bigger scar after that. So allow the scabs to form. They act as like a temporary bandage, right? Because humans have been around a lot longer than Band-Aids have been around, and so there was a time where we didn't have Band-Aids. We didn't have a way to cover a wound, and so our bodies scab over to act as like a temporary covering for a wound. Now thankfully we live in modern medicine, so cover your wounds if they happen. With that increase of blood flow, though, you get things called fibroblasts. And if you remember from our tissues discussion, fibroblasts are going to start to secrete different fibers into an area, things like collagen and elastic fibers, to be able to stitch the edges of the wound together. And this is when you start to get into like the itchy phase, right? You know how sometimes when something's healing, when a scratch or a scar, a wound is healing, it might start to be a little itchy. It's this fibroblast area. It's where all of these sticky fibers are being released to help kind of cling things together into this really kind of weird meshy net thing. So once you have your blood clot formed, it starts to scab over. Underneath the scab, it starts to all kind of get healed back together. Then you have these phagocytic cells that help to remove debris and dead cells. So kind of think about it like a construction project, right? The first couple of steps are just stabilizing it. Let's say, there's a building that needs to be repaired. Okay, we can't just knock down the building. We have to go in there and we have to put up in some structural supports, and we put in some framework, and we put in, some scaffolding to help hold everything in place. And then you start to go in there and you start to chip away at parts that need to be replaced and repaired, things that need to be removed, things that are rotten and no longer good. All of that cleanup starts to happen. And then once that cleanup is kind of finished, you have that damaged tissue is all being replaced and the scab sloughs off. So new fresh cells can kind of come in and take the place of this debris and dead cells. And then once all that's done, again, the scab naturally just kind of falls. Okay, so we're still in this one though. Extensive collagen fiber production in the area may form an elevated area called a scar. So as your body is repairing itself, sometimes it over delivers and it kind of produces too much of a certain fiber of these collagen fibers, and so that causes a scar to form, and it kind of can create a slightly raised area. Sometimes your body will then regress and will actually start to kind of destroy those extra cells, and so that's why scars can fade over time. It might look really intense right when it's first formed, and then as weeks, months, years go by, it's like, oh yeah, that scar isn't there anymore. Of course, this isn't true for deep wounds, but for ones that are kind of just in that dermal area, it's possible for those scars to go away. Large wounds leaving scars can be accompanied by the formation of granulations. So if someone has a granuloma, that is a small tumor filled with this tissue. So you have a new branch of a blood vessel growing into an area. The vessel is accompanied by a cluster of fibroblasts that produce those collagen fibers. And eventually the blood vessels are resorbed, the fibroblasts leave, and that leaves that scar of collagen fibers. So it's just, again, the granulations, the collagen fibers, they're just kind of this clump. And sometimes they can retain fluid, sometimes they'll hold onto blood as well, and so if they're sliced open, they kind of bleed a little bit more. But hopefully the idea is that eventually your body kind of regresses and takes that extra tissue away. Sometimes these granulations can get kind of large and can start to impede normal movement and normal function, and so they have to be surgically removed. Here you can see the stages in the wound healing. So starting up here with the wound, you can see all the blood that's being released into the area. These blood vessels have been cut. This one goes down deep into the dermis, almost into the hypodermis, and so it's probably going to bleed pretty well. As the blood is starting to leak from these vessels, you have this release of white blood vessels into the area just to help with cleanup. And then you can see in this second slide, you can see that this epithelial tissue is starting to form. The blood clot, the scab is already formed up here at the top. So we're no longer actively bleeding. And so our body is starting to release or the fibroblasts are starting to move into the area. The macrophages are starting to go in and kind of remove this excess tissue. And then as more fibroblasts are brought into the area, because these blood vessels have been cut, so they're just leaking. They're leaking blood all over, and as they're leaking blood, they're releasing fibroblasts. And you can see how they're kind of scattering even more and more. They're producing even more tissue. They're filling in this epithelial space. And then you have this regenerated epidermis. The scab is ready to kind of fall off. The wound is sealed now. And then you have all this scar tissue underneath. So this is why some people, after a wound, they say, oh, well, I still have like a little bit of numbness in my fingers or a numbness in that spot. Oh, I can't really feel anything there. It's because some of these, and during the damage process, during the wounding process, and then the repair process, the body is just kind of repairing connective tissue and epithelial tissue. Notice we didn't say anything about muscle tissue or nervous tissue repair. Those are completely different processes, and they take a lot longer. And so you may have a period of time where there's some numbness, because all this is under here is just connective tissue. There's no actual sensory tissue in this area right now. And so, yeah, it might just slightly impede the function. Hopefully over time, those nerves can regrow or kind of find new pathways, and so that functionality can be returned. But it's not always guaranteed. These next two slides are just common skin disorders: acne, alopecia, athlete's foot, birthmark, boil. It has the disorders, the descriptions, and then sorry, I didn't realize that kind of confused me for a second. You have two kind of rows here, and then a whole other slide here. Go through, review these, be familiar with some of them. But for lecture purposes, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of these different things. I don't think we get too much into identifying the differences between things like a birthmark and a boil. But these slides are very helpful, maybe in your own area, in your own life. A lot of people might have some of these different conditions, and it's kind of interesting to see, oh yeah, that is, urticaria, or that's, seborrhea. So familiarize yourself with these different skin disorders. All right, that was the end of the show. Hope you liked it. And if you have any questions, please reach out.